let's go into introductions. To myself, my name is Mike Fossey. I'm the head of sales here at ARC. I've been in the HR tech field for about 15 years. So while I'm not a recruiter, I'm well versed in all things hiring. And then I want to introduce Ryan Choi. Right, I'm sure you're familiar. He is the director at Y Combinator. But Ryan, if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you ended up here, let's go ahead and kick it over to you.
Yeah, I'll try to keep the abbreviated version. But first, thanks for having me, Mike and ARC team. Love being able to talk about the job market, finding jobs. It's what we do here on my team and my roles at YC. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, I'm Ryan. I work here at Y Combinator. I'm a director of our hiring platform, which is Work at a Startup, workatastartup.com. And we help people find jobs at YC startups. I guess the inverse is also true. We help our founders hire and build their teams. So I spend about half of my time with our founders and their hiring teams, trying to help them put together a great game plan for how to build a phenomenal team, how to find great talent, how to do interviews, how to evaluate, how to compensate. So I'm happy to talk about all of those things, especially in this weird market. And I spend the other half of my time actually writing code, doing product, and building our hiring platform, which is like an Indeed.com, but just for vetted, funded YC startups. And so I have a lot of conversations with job seekers, product and operations, how to get a first job, how to think about what stage company they should join, what the pros and cons of working at a startup versus working at a larger company are, and happy to cover all of that stuff in so much as I can be helpful.
All right, so excellent. I look forward to a good conversation today.
Yeah.
Sorry, what was that?
Oh, sorry, there's a little bit of feedback. So I was saying if people could just make sure that they're muted.
Oh, yes. Good question. So as you come in, you should be automatically muted, but let's just keep that in mind if we are getting some feedback here. I saw Gina's already making a post here, but thank you so much. So jumping in, I guess, Ryan, you were, at the time you were engineer, number 7 at Salesforce. Yeah. I worked at Salesforce for a brief minute, and this was at the end of the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. I think at that time it was my first sales job. I was at Citrix selling a product called Go to My PC, if anybody's familiar with that. So we were both, I guess, kind of early on in our careers during that time, but any thoughts or insights into, what we might expect this time around compared to that financial crisis of 2007, 2008, assuming that we are maybe heading towards a recession or at least a high level of downturn, right?
Yeah, I think there's two sides of this. One is for founders and what they should do, especially in this market. And one is for job seekers. And so the advice kind of goes with both sides. On the founder side, we've told our founders, it's been on Twitter and other platforms, to really get lean, to look at their teams, to look at their spend, and to get to a place where the business ultimately is healthy, right? We think that's important because in order to survive as a startup during a bad market, you have to be able to have enough money to withstand potentially a bad economy, potentially losing some customers, potentially funding drying up for at least a little bit of time. Now, while that sounds scary as a job seeker, it also means that in certain pockets of trying to find a job, at least YC companies are in a better spot. They've thought about this. They've done what they needed to get lean, and the jobs that are posted hiring, they've been really thoughtful around what that looks like in the longer term. And so if you take that into consideration when you're looking for a job, being able to ask, just like you would back in 2007 or even 2001, what your funding situation is, how much runway, how much money you have in the bank, are things that you should be thinking about when you're talking about these companies, to know that they're healthy, to know that they can employ you, to know that you can be there for 1, 2, 3 years and make sure that they can endure the market. And I think the companies that did this back in the first recession, the first recession talking about you and I of like 2007 or even 2002, they were able to endure. Salesforce back then actually had layoffs. They had layoffs and they had to let go a good quarter of the team, and it was tough and it was painful. But those people that got laid off, a lot of them found jobs elsewhere because there were other companies that were hiring that were being careful about their spend, careful about their growth. And we're seeing that in this market too. There are companies that are are very conscientious, still growing, doing well, even excelling in a downturn. And so the trick is to try to find those companies and to land a job at them.
Gotcha. Is it common for companies to be willing to share financial information during an interview?
I think when we talk to our startups, we tell them to. We say that in full transparency, like someone is trusting in you and your business, you're employing them, you owe it to them to be honest about what the business is, what the financials looks like, what you're excited about, but also what the downside could be. Not all companies will do that. Not all startups are getting that advice. And that's unfortunate. We wish that all companies would do so because you're trusting 2 or 3 years of your life, your career working with the company. The least they could do is be as transparent as possible about where they think it's going and what the risks are. Because joining a startup can be risky, right? Not all startups succeed, and I'm sure everyone on this call and everyone who's looking at startups knows this. There's certainly plenty of upsides or plenty of benefits of working at startups, but you need to know with eyes wide open what you're getting yourself into.
Gotcha. No, that's great advice. Thank you. So I want to just kind of pivot here to, this is advice geared more towards, actual founders, leaders, whether you're a manager or any sort of leadership position or a founder yourself, you might find this relevant. So Ryan, you've been around some of the tech's, top founders, and from your time at YC and outside of it, you're now managing, as you mentioned, work at a startup, which is a platform for YC. And you're helping people connect with startup founders and jobs, right? So as you're well aware of many of the pain points that job seekers have, any advice on what a startup founder or just a company in general can do to attract candidates during these uncertain times?
Yeah, I think in terms of attracting great talent, there's a lot of people who are, it's funny, you'd imagine that given the uncertain times, there's two things happening. Certainly people are looking for jobs because maybe there's a company like Rivian or something that had a downturn. But it also turns out that there are people who are just generally nervous about the situation that they're in. And it's not a situation of oh, I'm in a small startup and therefore only the people who are at startups are nervous. People at larger companies too, people who are at large companies that might have hired too much during COVID, or that might have gotten too big, or that might have a little bit of a rocky season in terms of revenues. People there are nervous as well. And so a lot of people across the board are looking. My advice to founders is, number one, look at what your business is, look at what your model is, and see if you can find some of those people. See if you can find people who are open to new opportunities, even though things might seem fine, might seem stable, because you never know what type of position people are in to be looking for a new role. You can't read people's minds. Our job platform has helped hire over 1,600 people. So from that perspective, it's working pretty well. And so they should be checking out the work at a startup platform. But it's not any easier or any harder during this weird market environment, because one thing that's distinctly different, Mike, if you can appreciate this as well, is that back in 2001, 2002, when there was a downturn, a lot of people came to California as if it were a gold rush. A lot of my colleagues at Salesforce were people who had come from North Carolina or Minnesota, coming to work in tech. And when the market downturn happened, there were actually just fewer companies in tech in San Francisco back then. There were fewer companies that were hiring. And certainly the big ones would gobble up all the people that were looking for jobs, but there were fewer startups and fewer tech companies. Nowadays, there are just so many companies. There's been so much funding. There was so much money put into the market in the last couple of years that there are lots of companies with $2, $3, $4 million of cash on hand that are just hiring, as well as the Googles, the Apples, the Facebooks. So there are so many jobs available still. And it just means that it's still a very competitive market for job seekers. Now, internationally, we're seeing slightly different dynamics. There's a lot of people who are international. Luckily, there are more tech companies internationally than there have been certainly in the last 10 years. So that's good. I think the more interesting thing is just that the concentration is maybe not in a specific country. And so we're seeing and telling founders that if there are adjacent countries, if you happen to be in the EU, if you happen to be in LATAM, but Spanish speaking, those adjacencies actually work really well for both sides. And because of remote work, because of tools like Deal, which is a company that helps with hiring and employment across country borders, it makes it a lot easier for companies and for potential employees to be working across borders.
Right. Yeah, I mean, on that note, I definitely agree. I think, to the original question, if you're having trouble finding talent in your local environment, right, remote work is a great way to not only, find really top talent, but also help meet some DEI initiatives of your company, as well as you mentioned the partnership with Deal. We actually have a partnership with Deal where we can help companies actually find great talent remotely. And then our partnership with a company like Deal can actually help avoid some tax and compliance. So I think what we've been telling a lot of founders who come to us for advice is, going remote is a great way to actually increase the range of your talent pool while also helping reduce a little bit of the cost, right? Because as things become more concentrated in a localized environment, salaries, prices, cost of livings tend to go up, and that hurts companies. So going outside of that, whether you stay within your country of origin or open to hiring candidates elsewhere, it's also a great part of the strategy. So good to hear that YC and work at a startup are incorporating that as well. So the next question here is, we're talking about working at a startup, right? It usually means a level of risk and job insecurity. What can founders do to kind of ease the concerns of some of these prospective hires who might be hesitant to join, especially during a downturn or recession, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll give you the advice that I give our founders, which is get your business in order. Make sure that your financials are good. Make sure that your runway is good. Make sure that you're in a good position and you're thinking about both, whether it's ARR, annual recurring revenue, MRR, monthly recurring revenue, the amount of money effectively that you're going to make. Get that in order first, and then come up with a hiring plan. We see too many founders, not YC founders, but we see too many founders who think that they have money, therefore they should be hiring. And it's odd. Like I said, I talk to founders all the time. We actually give a hiring talk, and we tell them, don't take that advice, right? Think about the health, think about how long your business is going to be good for. If you had no more money, no more capital, try to get in the black, not in the red, and build a healthy business. That's the first thing. If you can't do that as is, then you should figure out what your team looks like, right? And you definitely should not be hiring. That's the advice that we give them. And that advice then goes directly to people looking for jobs, because, we don't want our companies putting themselves in a bad situation by overhiring and running out of money too quickly. So that means that the jobs on the platform on work at a startup are ones in which they thought about that. They thought critically about their hiring, their positions, their runway, and only those that are in a good, healthy state are going to be open. And right now we have like 5,000 jobs open. So we're lucky that we have a lot of these companies that are in a good spot, but we're always working with them to make sure that they are not overhiring and that they're making sure they're in a good position. So that's what we're telling them. And that puts them in the best position to both grow a healthy business and hire smart. The next thing that we talk about is like what roles are actually important. And this has to do a little bit more with the stages of company. At YC, we break it down into 4 stages. One is the seed stage, where you might not even have a product out there. You might have raised $2, $3, $4 million just from YC and early stage investors. The next is a Series A, where you've either close or have raised a Series A, which might be at this point like $10, $15 million is what we're seeing in some cases in the market. And you probably have hit product market fit. Then we have growth, which means you've absolutely hit product market fit and you are now here to conquer the world, get as many customers as possible. And the last is at scale, which is just a very large operating company, a la Instacart, Scale, DoorDash is already public. Whatnot has probably hit that stage as well. All these companies are hiring on the platform, but there are those 4 stages, and at different stages of the company, there are different roles that you should be hiring for. I say that because seed stage companies sometimes a founder will come and say, hey, we need a head of sales. And I'm like, well, why do you think you need a head of sales? I'm like, well, because I'm no good at sales. And as you would probably appreciate, if you're not good at sales, hiring someone to solve that problem for you is not going to work because you don't know what they should be doing. Similar to, founders that come to me and they're like, I'm looking for a head of product. What is it about product that you are not good at or that you don't want to do that you want to hire someone for? Well, I'm not good at talking to customers. Well, I'm not good at X, Y, or Z. And I'm like, you know what? You got to get really good about that. That's why you got into YC. You got this far. Do not delegate these key roles to people at a series or a seed stage role. When it gets to Series A, things change significantly because now things are actually kind of working and things are actually breaking. So if things are working and they're breaking versus they just never worked in the first place, it's a different situation. So bringing in some actually changes the equation. And so that's where we have to talk to them about, well, what types of roles at what stage matters. And the inverse of that helps people who are looking for jobs. If you're a product manager and you really want to do product, seed stage companies are just going to be harder to find them because there are fewer of them on the YC platform, fewer of them at early stage startups. And if they are hiring, you should ask what I'm asking. Like, why are you trying to hire someone this early on? What are the things that you need me to do? What are the problems that we're trying to solve here? Right. Yeah. And know that the founder has some experience, can guide you, can help you get to the point where you can be successful with the team.
Wow. Excellent. On that note, I guess I have a question for you. So, it's typical. We see companies usually around that 50 to 100 employee mark, right? Like coming up on their Series A. That's when they usually invest in their first hire to, attract talent, right? Usually a recruiter ahead of talent role. But now I'm seeing a lot of conversations advising that on earlier. What's your take on that? Do you think companies should invest in a talent acquisition type role earlier on? Or do you think that it's pretty common the way things have been done? That's probably the best route to go.
That's a great question. We have seen the most effective hiring at early stage seed, even Series A, have a lot of involvement from the founder, right? There's early stage companies, no one really knows who they are. There's not a lot of momentum. You're not on anyone's radar. Contrast that to later stage companies like, again, Instacart, Stripe, Dropbox. They hit a tipping point where the brand sells itself and there's tons and tons and tons of inbound. But up until that point, maybe it's like post Series B, it is a lot of legwork, a lot of muscle to make that happen. So early stage founders being very involved for the first 5, 10, maybe 20 hires. Yeah. When it hits to around post Series A, certainly by Series B, hiring and head talent makes sense. Maybe even before that, hiring someone who is a full stack recruiter, hiring someone who might be able to help on these other areas of sourcing, just to get the enough of a name and a word out there to have a lot of people to bring in for coffee chats and to talk to.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, thank you. So, let me make sure I'm muted there. Sorry. We want to go ahead and kind of switch gears now, right? We've talked about some advice for founders or those in leadership or hiring managers in general. I want to switch it over now to advice for developers, specifically job seekers, or those entertaining a new role in the near future. So I guess first question, like if someone, a software developer or even somebody in our audience today has a job, but they're thinking of looking for something new, would you say now is a good time to do that?
Are we talking about in the market or just in their career? I think that's the distinction that I'd make. The market is the market. And if you're an engineer, the market is actually really strong for engineers. When I talk to people, I ask them what they're looking for. I ask them what they're looking for in their next challenge, their next role, what do they want to learn, and what's the environment that they want to be in to learn it, right? So independent of the market, ask yourself those questions. The next thing, which is kind of strange because I'm sitting here I talk about, finding jobs at YC startups. The next thing is, can you learn it at your company? I'm trying to find out ways in which people can benefit themselves. And a lot of times it's just thinking about ways that they can learn more at their company, ways they can have conversations with their boss or their founders or wherever they're at to learn the things that they want because you're already there. And that's in some cases the easiest. So from that perspective, frame it from what it is that you want to learn, what skills you want to learn, who you want to be learning from, and if the area that you're working in is still exciting. If it turns out that some of those things are not true, then yeah, you should start looking independent of the market. You should start looking at what other opportunities there are. You should talking to friends. You should start looking at our platform. You should start, engaging with the mentors on Codementor. Those are the things that are the things that you should be doing. But for engineers specifically, this market is still really, really strong. People will want to be working with you. So you have lots of options. I was, again, an engineer at Salesforce. I've been an engineer for the last 20 years writing code. I'm now a product person and a marketing person. And sometimes I'm like, well, why did I even leave? Because it's only gotten better and better over the last 20 years for engineers. I don't foresee that changing at any point.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, the common advice nowadays is it's a good time to look for a job when you want a new role, right? Regardless of the market, because you can find it out there. You just have to, obviously, like you said, leverage your connections, your friends, any resources available if you're not getting what you want. So excellent stuff. So talking about, I want to, with the, you kind of answered our next question. So I'm going to jump ahead, right? There have been, I want to say, horror, I don't want to call them horror stories, right? But there have been a lot of talks on LinkedIn. There's been a lot of companies where some of the chats have been, a senior software engineer accepted a position and then resigned from their current company, and then found out just before starting the offer was rescinded, right? I've seen a lot of posts on my LinkedIn of stories about this. There's been articles in TechCrunch and everything all about these. What, I guess, would you advise doing in that situation if you were that person that had resigned from their current company, accepted the offer, then the offer was actually pulled back? And then is there anything a developer could do or ask in an interview to maybe avoid something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've seen some of that happen as well on LinkedIn, and it's a bummer for people when that happens. I guess one of the things that someone told me really, really early in my career is that the world of tech is small. So make sure that you are building good relationships and that you are not burning bridges. Burning bridges. Like, that's the first thing. Because if you take it from that mentality and you leave your company amicably, right? You don't make it painful. You don't make it drawn out. You make it very clear what's happening. And that happens. You might be able to just go back. You might be able to just go back because they gainfully employed you for a while. You left for a reason that wasn't burning bridges on the way out and saying, I hate all these things. This is all the things you need to change. And you're just like, well, this is just a new opportunity and I'm looking forward to it. And I'd love to keep in touch. You might just be able to go back. That's the first thing to always keep in mind, because tech, the network is small. And the other reason to do that is that when you're looking for your next job, you don't know where your former employees, your former boss, your former colleagues are going to be in the future. And that's as strong a network as any to find your next job. And in the event that you have a situation like that happening, go on LinkedIn, download your CSV of all your contacts, and you'd be surprised where they are. And you'd be surprised who you can reach out to and say, hey, this happened and I'm looking for a new role. And if you follow those two steps, you might land up in a pretty reasonable place. Certainly it's not an ideal situation, but you'd be, that's one of the first things that I would try.
Gotcha. No, I think that's good advice. Excellent. Okay. So, things seem to be, at the time we had planned this, we've gotten some better news around the economy, right? But things are still not ideally looking great. And we're talking about now, everybody's been hit by this, right? There's been a big increase in inflation. So meaning their paychecks probably didn't go as far as they did a year ago or even before that. Do you think now is a good time to maybe ask for a raise or an increase just due to inflation? Or would you advise those, it might be too risky at the moment? I think what this is coming from is hear people, concerned that if they ask for a raise, right, given the uncertainty of their job, it could reflect poorly, right? Could even end up in them being let go or something. But how do you propose people address the inflation issue in regards to their salary?
Yeah, number one, I always say you have no downside in asking for more nicely and not making it a standoff. I think I hear a lot of the similar questions around negotiation and how to ask for more. And in most roles, I say there's no harm in asking for more equity. There's no harm in asking for more base salary when you're negotiating. Again, similar advice: don't make it a standoff. Don't make it an ultimatum. Do this or I'll leave. Like, that doesn't benefit you, and it actually sets the wrong tone going both ways. I tell our startups, I tell our founders not to give exploding deadline offers, because that also sets the wrong experience. So hopefully they're following my advice. And if you're on work at a startup and you're talking to them and they're not doing that, shoot me a note, because I do want to know. But we give them that advice. And I think the same advice applies to when you're working at a place. You're already delivering value. You're already being helpful, contributing. And I say that when you ask for more, make it a values-based thing. I do think that there's an element to the market, and we tell our founders to adjust for inflation because the market has gone up. Also, realistically, if our startups are not paying close enough to market rate, they're not going to hire anybody. You got to look at this from a marketplace perspective, where if they're competing against the Facebooks, the Googles, the Netflixes of the world that can pay more, and you're trying to pay less, they're not going to be able to attract any talent. So they have to keep up with inflation. Otherwise, they're not going to have people working for them. But if you feel like you deserve more, then you should go in there. You should ask for it. You should try not to be too emotional about it, because if you get emotional about it to a point where it becomes a standoff, that's neither good for you nor good for the company. You don't want to get to that place. But anchor it in principles, anchor it in what you've done, anchor it in what you've done certainly differently or above and beyond what you did in the last review. And if the answer is no, or if it's not clear, then ask what it takes to get to that next level, because that's what's important to you. I will give this other weird wrinkle, which is we tell our startups not to pay the most. And I will tell this to any founder out there, that paying the most usually is not the situation you want to be in. If you are in negotiation with an employee, an engineer, or a candidate or an engineer who is considering multiple offers, and there's no problem considering multiple offers, but going out there and trying to extract the most water out of the stone, I've generally found that people who are looking for that, number one, tend to leave first, because what matters most is they get paid the most. And there's always going to be someone out there who will pay you more, right? And so in terms of building a team, those people tend to leave first, and that's not necessarily the type of person that you want to hire. Now, if that's what you're looking for as a job seeker and that's your MO, by all means, go for it. You do you. But just know that, yeah, you're not going to get paid top dollar at early stage startups. You're going to get equity, and hopefully that equity will be worth something. If you want to get paid top dollar, then go to larger companies in terms of base salary and all in pay, because those are the ones that are going to be able to. But I've been at those companies. I've made those mistakes, and they shouldn't, but so be it.
That's good advice. I mean, I think, even as a job seeker, you should always consider everything. My salary is not the only driver, right? What is the opportunity you mentioned earlier? What can you learn in the role? Talk about equity components, talk about benefits and perks, and all that kind of rolls into a total offer. It's always not just salary. So, it's good to hear that that's still in alignment today. Let's see. So I think that kind of concludes some of our chat for today. We came in a little bit early, so why don't we go ahead and jump into some questions, if that's good for you. So I guess first question, we got one here. Right? What do you think are some of the top hiring trends in the current job market?
Top hiring trends. Is there anything in more specific that person can follow up with regards to, what area, what role, what industry that they're looking at? Hiring trends are just so broad, and you could go to the economy saying, hey, the U.S. jobs report reported there are more jobs that are available, and therefore the market is doing great. The answer is somewhere in between. So if there's more context, you can add that. Otherwise, we can go to the next question.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it wasn't. So I appreciate that. But yeah, so let's see. Is there any way to kind of, I guess someone asked here, are there any platforms, tools, anything like that to verify the offers that are made, especially from startups, I guess, in terms of whether or not they're legit? I'm not quite sure the ask here, but
Yeah.
yeah.
In terms of tools, the things that I would recommend, number one is there's a tool called levels.fyi where people self-report their base compensation, not necessarily equity, and they actually map it to the leveling system that Google, Facebook, Netflix uses for engineers, L2, L3, L4. By the time you get to L6 or 7, you're talking about technical or principal, and architect is like L8. And so you can see the compensation mapped to what those companies offer at the level, and that sometimes helps you understand, based on, it's not a direct map of years of experience to level, but what range might look like. That we find to be useful, and I tell a lot of candidates that that's something to look for. The other one is to just look at lots of jobs and the postings and their offer of base salary and equity. On Work at a Startup, you have the ability to look at how much base salary ranges are and how much equity percent is actually being offered. Now, it's not always going to be accurate, but that's a good starting point to figure out, well, based on years of experience, what might I be able to expect? The last is just to ask, for roles that you're interested in, reach out, talk to the founders, talk to the people, and figure out what their range is to get a better sense. And I think those are the things to use. Or a framework to use to figure out what the comp might be. Also, if you're already employed, that's a starting point. And so hopefully you're looking for that or a little bit more upward, and use those tools to get you to a place where you want to be.
Gotcha. No, that's good. We got another one here. So I found this actually interesting. Any advice regarding how to access the hidden candidates who might not be actually looking for a job? Talking about passive candidates, right? So outside of just using outreach on LinkedIn Recruiter, what are some other ways to find that more passive talent, but those who are really great rock stars, but outside of just a platform like LinkedIn? Any advice on how to find those types of candidates?
Yeah. Hiring is building a network and using that network and growing that network to find other people who might be excited. So one of the mistakes that I see from our founders often when they're getting started in hiring is to be just purely transactional. Do you want to work here or not? Now, if you just started a company, no one has heard of you. No one knows what you're doing. No one probably even knows you. And so the answer is almost certainly no. If you approach it slightly differently as networking, like I want to get to know this person because this person may want to work here, but also this person looks good and maybe they know people that might want to work here. It frames it differently. So founders go in as a conversation to meet people, to show them more about what you're up to learn what that person is interested in, and then also to ask, well, hey, we might have a couple of roles here. If there's anybody that you know that might be interested in this role or what we're doing, I'd love to talk to them. This is advice that one of our partners, Harj, who is the founder of TripleByte, gives our founders, and we tell them this. And it's actually very powerful if done well, because it's very sincere. It's very natural. It's like, I want to get to know you, and I want to know if you'd want to work here. Maybe there's other people who want to work here that you might know. And if you think about it that way, it builds. We've actually talked to founders who use Work at a Startup, and they take the same approach. And they're like, well, I didn't hire someone on that platform, but that person that I talked to introduced me to this person, or 2 degrees, and we hired that person. And that's the right way to do it, right? Like we tell our founders, Work at a Startup is not the only source to hire people. And if you're only using it, you're not going to hire as fast as you want to. I think that was the advice that I was giving when this thing was starting, and it was like 100 companies on the platform. Now it's like 1,100 companies on the platform. We've made a lot of hires. So I'm like, you should definitely use this platform, but make sure that you're not forgetting that there's a networking component to building a great brand, attracting great talent, and finding people that might want to work here. The other thing is, yes, LinkedIn, from what I understand, has in many cases like a sub 10 or 9 to 11% response rate if you're trying to reach out about jobs. I think that a lot of people are doing it wrong. A lot of people are spamming. A lot of people, founders or recruiters, are going out there and just having template messages where by the 10th, 20th, 100th message, it's easy to use a template, copy paste. But as someone who's on the other side of that, you can tell when when the person who's reaching out to you is tired, or they're sending their 100th message. They're
Right.
not putting the time and effort into it. And
Yeah.
so you reciprocate by saying, well, it's not worth my time to reply. Personalizing, making sure that you're noticing something about that person, and then you have a reason to reach out and why you're excited to reach out is key to make sure that you're writing a personalized message that gets a response. And my feedback to founders is like, if you get to that point, that barrier, that you are having a problem finding something to point out, or you lack the energy to personalize,
Yeah.
stop reaching out. You can always do it tomorrow. You can always do it the next day, but the smell of you being exhausted or like wanting to phone it in when doing sourcing will mean that people won't reply, and that's the worst thing that you could do for your own benefit.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I've definitely been on the receiving end of some where even the autofill and the templates hasn't been completed. Right. So I can definitely hear that. I got a question here. Interesting. So what are the methods that one can use to gauge how much they deserve or how much they should be in terms of earnings, where they're at in their career? The comment associated with this question is I think most people end up accepting offers where they're getting less than they deserve because they don't know how to gauge their own value or even ask for what they want. Any advice on that? It's largely geared towards job seekers.
Yeah. So I think, again, levels.fyi is a tool that'll give you some insight into what you think you should be making. I think there is some self-assessment of where you're at in your career, what matters to you, and how that maps to what a FANG company would offer you or, would give you. Also, just, make sure that if you think that you're worth more, make a values-based argument when you're given an offer for why you think you should be earning more. Really, that's what it comes down to. I'm happy to field a question that might be more specific. Compensation is it's funny. Compensation is a lesser talked about thing about employment and jobs than certainly you realize. One thing to do, to be honest with you, is ask your friends. Whatever it is that you have done to get to the position of being an expert in operations or engineering or design, you probably were around a cohort of people who did the same thing. And so asking your friends what they make as a helpful way to gauge what you should be making isn't the worst idea. I went to business school as well, and it was the first time that people were very much openly talking about compensation, and it turned out to be very helpful, and it destigmatized these conversations because you're actually trying to help each other. So that's one thing, because you are probably naturally in a cohort of people who are at the same level, experience, role as you, and that'll help you gauge whether or not the offers that you're getting are fair. I'm also happy to chat about it too, as I'm sure Mike and other people at ARC are. So feel free to shoot me a note, Ryan at Y Combinator, and happy to talk about people's individual situations ad nauseum.
Excellent. Well, we appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I guess on that note, right, this is not a question here from the audience, but something I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. I mean, on ARC, right, we have the developers set their desired salary rate ahead of time. So companies come in already know, and then the companies reach out with a kind of a range on salary. What are your thoughts on salary transparency and being upfront about what the role pays as part of the first part of the interview process? Do you think that's a good strategy for all employers to leverage, or even job seekers?
I think companies should be able to offer a range, off the bat. And the range, honestly, can be flexible, because in the first conversation, they actually don't know your level. They don't know your skill set. They don't know what you're bringing to the table. And so without knowing that, it's hard to say you're going to come in as a junior engineer, a mid-level engineer, a senior engineer, or an architect. It's hard to tell. So that's why there is a range. I think it's okay to ask what that range is and for them to give a fairly wide range. And then we tell our founders to say, a lot of it has to do with the level that you're coming to the table with. And I think that's a good starting point. As it gets further into the conversation and you know more about the company and the company knows more about your skill level through the interviews, then that's where it starts to triangulate. That's what we've seen at Salesforce, and I was at Twitter and at Lyft. In the process, it sucks, I think, as a job seeker, because you want a little bit more certainty. But that's the reason that you don't always get that certainty. Now, not getting any information off the top, that's hard, right? That's hard because you just don't know what you're getting yourself into or where it might end up. So I think it's fine to ask and say, well, can you at least give me something in the ballpark? I think other people are just like, I don't feel comfortable giving how much I'm making, which is perfectly reasonable. Like there's laws and regulations about companies not asking that. But if you are making a very large amount of money and this company might not be able to pay you, it benefits you to not waste your time by telling them, hey, this is how much I'm making. And if you can't match it, then, don't want to waste your time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think, regardless of your role, right? Sales, developer, marketing, however, a lot of the interview process, especially in tech, they're very lengthy, right? It's not one or two calls. There's usually a long presentation. I know when I hire salespeople, we always do a mock pitch, and it takes time and preparation. I think it's considerate to both parties to kind of be upfront about the salary that you're looking for, right? Because you want to make sure that could potentially be a deal breaker right there. So having that conversation early upfront, not waiting till the end and trying to do that negotiation process at the end, at least making sure that you're within range, like you mentioned, right? It doesn't have to be an exact number, but making sure that they're aligned to pay well within the means of what you're looking for as a job seeker, and vice versa, because you don't want to waste anyone's time. And as a company, it helps your talent brand, right? Let's appreciate that up front. So it's good to hear. I have another unique question here. I found this interesting. Anything like in terms of like key points or factors that you should consider to evaluate startups before joining? If there are multiple opportunities, let's say, and you're developing, you've got a couple things, like what would you look for, right? I know I've heard like, look at the founders, look at the funding, look at the product, but anything on your end that you would give as advice here?
I really boil it down to, what do you want to learn and who can you learn that from at this new role? Right. When you're starting your career, and I'm sure we have a wide variety, maybe people can put in the chat, how many years of experience they have and what they're doing, so we can tailor it a bit more. But certainly earlier on in your career, and I found this to be even true in, like 20 years in, that I'm looking and evaluating opportunities based on what I'm going to learn, who I'm going to learn it from, and how quickly I can learn it. Right. Because that's where I want to be. I'm not necessarily optimizing for how much money I'm making. Although, when I tell people this, if you actually focus on learning, you're going to learn so much faster, and that'll actually benefit you on the back end much better. So really focusing on what you want to learn and who you're going to be learning it from, who you're surrounding yourself with. Now, at early stage companies, our founders have worked at Facebook, have worked at Fang, have worked at other YC startups, and they've seen companies go from like 0 to 1 to 0 to scale, and they're starting companies, and they're formidable people to learn from, and you get to work directly from them versus like 4 steps removed at a larger company or even like a larger startup. And so that's one of the things that you get to do. Certainly, if you want to start a startup, joining a startup is a great way to do it, especially if those founders have been at a YC startup or have been at a startup that has been successful. And so really it comes down to what it is that you want to learn and putting yourself in that situation. Now, if you want to learn how to manage, if you want to learn how to like manage multi-level groups and organizations, if you want to learn how to operate in a large organization, you shouldn't go to a startup. That doesn't make any sense, because you're going to be like 4 or 5 degrees removed from that until the company goes through Series A, Series B, grows. So, really, again, focusing on what it is that you want to learn, and then asking those questions of whether or not you're going to be able to learn that from the team. If you want to learn about managing, and then you go to an early stage startup and you're like, hey, 10-person startup, I'd love to learn about managing. The founders are going to be like, yeah, this ain't the place. But hey, maybe you should go talk to my former boss at Gusto, because I know that he's hiring a team for, first entry-level manager. And so in the same way as you're networking to find those open opportunities, and if for nothing else, our founders have a pretty rich network. Like Y Combinator, I guess we didn't talk about it in tremendous amount of detail, but Y Combinator is an accelerator / incubator that put first money in companies like Airbnb, DoorDash, Dropbox, Instacart, Stripe. And so the network of our founders is massive. They've come from like places and have been pretty successful. And so building a network within this for job seeking purposes can be very, very powerful. And they're always sharing great talent that they're meeting and maybe might not be a great fit with the rest of the YC community as well.
Awesome. Excellent. All right. We got time, I guess, maybe 2 more questions. So here we go. I guess we talked a little bit about
unsolicited advice, just because the people here, if you're looking for a job, one of the most effective things I've ever seen people do in their job hunt is to come prepared with a project or some legwork before it's asked of you. And I know that not everyone has the opportunity to do so, but when you come prepared with even a few slides, a couple of discussion points that you want to talk about, light analysis of what you're excited about, it does 2 things. It shows that you are very excited about this opportunity, and that never hurts. And number 2, it frames your first conversations about what you want to talk about, right? Particularly at startups, that's effective because it shows that you're coming to the table with ideas, that you have ways to improve the business, and then your interviewers will actually want to talk about what you're talking about if you've done it well. Now, if you come in to talk about, you're interviewing an enterprise company and you're like, here's a little app that I built that's completely unrelated, that's GitLab open source, understand that they're probably going to look at it and be like, okay, cool. Well, let's get back to what we were talking about. But we were hiring someone for YC, and they came up with a 12-page slide where they basically went through work at a startup, said, these are the things that are wrong with it that I'd like to improve. Here are the areas where there's minor things. Here are the areas where there's like bigger ideas. Let's talk about it. So instead of the interview that I was going to give, I was just like, well, let's walk through this. Let's talk about why you're thinking about this, what improvements, metrics, X, Y, or Z. And it totally changed the conversation. I've done something like this at Lyft before, where I was being interviewed for an API position. So I reverse engineered their API. I used it, Oscar proxy. I just ran a bunch of queries through it. And I said, this is terribly inefficient. I imagine you're doing it for this reason. This is how I might break it up. And here's a little tool that I built. And it changed the entire conversation from what I found out after the fact to be like the hardest PM interview to something where he was actually my champion. And so, doing a little thing like that when you're very, very excited can be helpful. The lightweight version of this, by the way, when you're trying to find a job and you're reaching out to companies, is just to recommend or to suggest 3 things that you'd want to talk about or be excited about, right? So if you're reaching out to ARC and they're doing Codementor, or they're doing, building a hiring platform, or doing founders, be like, hey, based on the founder side and based on what I've seen as a candidate here, these are the 3 things that I'd be really excited to work on. Maybe you're thinking about them already, but I'd love to chat about it. So it shows that you're thinking about it, because you'd be surprised. 99.9% of people who are looking for jobs actually also just spam recruiters and spam founders. And that's not effective. I see that on the platform all the time, and people come to me and they're like, I've applied to 100 companies. I'm not getting any hits. And I tell them to send me the messages, and I'm like, because you're doing it wrong. And I get that it's a weird market, and I get that some people say that volume is the thing to do. But on both sides, that never works, right? On both sides, that is just the worst thing to do. So being able to spend a bit more time either in the opening intro, the opening outreach, and certainly by the time you get on the interview, will actually benefit you. Show people what you're good at, because that will help frame the conversation based on the things that you're interested in and on your own terms during the interview.
Definitely. I mean, and that's amazing advice. And I can actually add some, proof of concept to that, right? I did that a while back in my career early on. I had gotten past, I was interviewing for a sales role, and I received the rejection email. So the VP was a bit unsure of my skills. And so what I did was I actually got a freemium version of the product. It was a project management software. And I built a whole presentation using their software about why they should hire me. And I sent that back, and they changed their mind, and it came to it, right? So, I think your message there about, being creative and what really resonates, especially to me, but I'm sure to everybody here in the audience, is you got to think about, we just talked about recruiters sending templatized messages. Are you doing the same when you're seeking a job, right?
Yeah.
you just clicking on that apply easy with LinkedIn button, right? And are you reaching out to the hiring manager? Are you doing more than what's needed? Are you coming to the interview prepared? I think this is some really solid advice for anybody looking for work. Is it's more than just a resume, right?
Yeah.
And it's more than just a quick apply. So that's great
And
advice.
if you're not excited about, if you feel the urge to use templates and you're not excited enough to come up with two things that you'd be excited to work at the company, then maybe you shouldn't be applying, because maybe this company is not the right fit for you. You got to be at least a little excited. Like, as I said before, it starts with what you want to learn, what you want to do, who you want to learn it from, starting from there, and then using that as a point to come out from and say, okay, well, what are these companies? How do they fit what I'm looking for, the criteria? You might even have like 6 criteria that you're looking for, but if it doesn't match any of those 6 criteria, you just want to hit apply, you're kind of wasting your own time. I was giving a talk earlier where there was someone who came to me and said, I've applied to 100 positions. And I was just like, you're probably doing it wrong. I said, do this. He goes back, does it. He comes back, he's like, I've gotten 1 offer and 2 interviews. And I'm like, great. It does work if you're willing to put in the time. And it's a weird, wonky market, but those things help.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, excellent. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I want to let's do 1 or 2 more questions. So I guess, let's see. Where's this? I just lost track of this question. I thought it was very interesting. We talked earlier about understanding the financial health of the company and asking about this, right? Especially as we head into what could be an economic downturn, right? Somebody asked, what specific questions could you ask a new employer about the financial health so that you can feel real assured about taking an offer or not worrying too much about getting laid off in 3-6 months, something down the road? Is there anything specific that you should ask, or should you just ask to see the cap tables? Like, what do you think is some good advice there?
I don't know if I saw the cap tables, if I could even understand it, but the thing I would ask around is runway and burn rate. Those are the 2 things that everyone here should know if you're thinking about startups. Burn rate is the amount of money that you're spending on a monthly basis, right? How much is the company paying in terms of salary, in terms of offices, in terms of supplies and so forth. And then runway. Runway is the number of months that you have left until you literally run out of money. It's as simple as that, right? And you should ask those 2 questions. And if the founders don't answer, you should be concerned. You should genuinely be concerned. Now, the reason is that they should know this off the top of their head, and they should know how hiring you, early stage, later stage, they should know what their hiring plan looks like. If they succeed at hiring all the people they want, how that affects their runway and their burn rate. When I talk to founders, I tell them to tell me that with the baked in numbers of, if you hire all the people that you think you want to hire, what does it look like? The next thing they say is that if it's not 2 months left right now in this economic environment, I want you to reevaluate what you're doing and then come back and let's talk. 2 months. 2 months. One is because wherever you are at currently, you need 1 year to get your metrics in a place where you can start doing a next round of funding. And then you probably need another year to actually do the round of funding, right? And it's a safe 2-year cushion to get to where you want to be, which is like getting the metrics that you need to be at and then raising money so you can then go bigger, right? Now, they might not tell you all of those details. We tell our founders, like, again, try to be as transparent as possible, but at a minimum, runway and burn rate. And then hopefully back into a conversation about like, what is your revenue? And revenue is either annual revenue, annual ARR is annual recurring revenue. I talked about that earlier, or MRR, monthly recurring revenue, which is basically just how much money you're making. So if you know that you're burning this much and you know that you're making this much, then it turns out that you're cash flow positive and you can live on forever. So your runway is infinite. Right. If it's this, then you're actually dipping into savings. You're dipping into the $4, $5, $10, $20 million that you fundraised. And at some point that runs out. So unless you either figure this out and get, your revenue above your spend, you're going to have to fundraise. And that's where you have to have full perspective. And founders absolutely need to know these things. We tell our founders to know it. We tell them to pull back when they don't do it. So our founders, I genuinely believe, are going to be much better about both communicating and knowing these things. Your mileage may vary at other random startups where they're possibly getting bad advice. We even have founders who come back to me and they're like, well, my notable investor said that I just raised $5 million. He gave me $1 million, especially to like hire the team and scale this thing. And I'm like, no. Don't listen to them because that's what you want to hear. Don't listen to them because you think that they know what they're talking about.
Sure.
In some cases, they are more invested in you burning through their money faster to either make it big or to go out of business than anything else. And so that's not the right advice. Sound financials of a startup are the right advice. And so as someone joining the company, you should be asking questions around runway, burn rate, learn a little bit of business. There's actually a talk on our YC YouTube channel called The 9 Business Models. If you're a founder, you should absolutely read it because there's 9 business models that you can distill your business into. And if you're thinking of doing something different, I challenge to think that that's true. If you're a job seeker, it'll help you have more intelligent conversations around what the business is prior to asking these things to know, okay, well, this is a sound business. It's a marketplace. Marketplaces make money off the transaction. It's an enterprise. Therefore, it makes money off of LOIs or future LOIs, ARR, MRR, or, what have you.
Gotcha. No, that's great. So I guess our last question here, I like this one. I think it's interesting. And then that'll take us right up to time. So advice for very early stage, even like an individual startup, how to make their first hire. This question actually comes specifically, we're in seed stage, but how to convey or represent our company as a serious, legit company instead of someone with in their words, far-fetched idea. Any advice for hiring at the very early stage, I guess is what the question is.
Number one, hire your friends. Hire people that you've worked with before. Hire people that you know. Number one, it'll shortcut the process because interviewing and hiring is pretty painful on both sides in many cases. You already have a tremendous amount of trust, which is hugely important going both sides of how fast you can move. There's a book up there called The Speed of Trust that you should look at, where like people who trust each other can move so quickly, and with distrust it gets harder. Not to say that you distrust new employees, but you certainly trust people that you've went to school with, worked with, and if you raised a seed round, like you can employ them in good faith. Use the things that I said about like building your network. Don't over-index on people who want to get paid top dollar. Don't just try to source people from FANG companies. You'd be surprised that like it's just not as effective. People are at Google for 20 years for a reason. And they might be curious and they might be really great at being able to help you with your, AI-driven mining company. Yeah. But they also like the paycheck and they like the benefits, not just financial benefits of just like dry cleaning, childcare at Google, that you're not going to be able to support. If you only try to source people from the large companies, you're going to fail. The last thing I'd throw out there is have a solid interview process that tests for abilities, right? Not puzzles, not things that other people have taught you should care about. Like, can you do a sorting algorithm of O of n squared complexity fast enough? Like those things, if they're not relevant to what you do, don't ask them. Try to make it as work-like as possible, as work simulation as possible. Take the time to prepare an open source code where someone can debug it and add a new feature, because that's what you do, and try to make it as work-like as possible, so you can find reasons to say yes, not find reasons to be like, oh, this person's not smart enough because they don't know a crazy-ass algorithm. Pardon my French. We tell our founders to do the same thing. We tell them to look for reasons to say yes. We tell them if they can, pay people to do trials, like 2-day, 3-day trials. Not everyone can operate like that from a candidate side, so be flexible, but try to make it as much of a simulation and less of an interview. And you're going to be able to find hidden talent that other companies have not found. We at YC have founders come back and give talks. And Patrick Cullison, the founder of Stripe, said the first 50 hires were people that FANG companies, Google, Facebook, Amazon, overlooked. Great, solid people that we only identified because we had a solid process. And we weren't just looking for shiny resumes with people who had already proven that they were accomplished. And that's what startups have to do.
Yeah. That's great. Okay. Well, we are at time, and I think we actually got through all the questions. So I think let's go ahead and just wrap up here. But I want to obviously, Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time and coming here. I think this was a very fruitful conversation. A lot of good takeaways for both those looking for potential new roles and also those trying to hire. I even learned some stuff, so this is great. And then we'll be sharing the recording out here. But thank you everybody for taking the time. I saw early on there's a lot of people from all over, right? So a lot of people who are up in the middle of the night or very early in the morning. So thanks everybody for joining us. We hope you found it valuable. Go check out YC, work at a startup. Take a look at ARC. We're hiring, for remote job seekers everywhere. And, looking forward to keeping the conversation going online. So thank you, everybody. All right.
Thank you so much for the opportunity here. It was a lot of fun. Hopefully we helped a couple people find some advice, and it's fun.
All right. Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it. Let's go ahead and I guess we'll exit the room here and we'll circle up.